Welcome to the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. We're going to explore ways to sharpen our diagnostic skills, find learning resources, and hear from experts in the automotive field. I am happy to have Automotive Seminars as a sponsor for the show. Now, if you're not familiar, Automotive Seminars is a diagnostic technician training company. They've got a website that there'll be a link to in the show notes. And what they offer is top-notch training to technicians like us in the field. I've been taking their training courses for years and have got a ton of benefit out of it. They've got top-notch instructors, John Thornton, Scott Shotton, Scott Manna, and every other month they've got a 2-night course that you can sign up for. Join in, ask questions, and afterwards, you've paid for the course, you can access a recorded version whenever you want. You can rewatch the class 2 years later in case you wanted some details on it. And that is a fantastic feature. So make sure to check out the website to see what courses they have available and what's coming up in the future. Hey, what's going on, automotive world? Welcome to another episode of the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. My name is Sean Tipping. I will be your host once again for this week's episode. Thank you so much for joining me. Today on the show, I've got another case study for you. This was an interesting no-start diagnostic on a 15 Toyota Prius. So if you work on Toyota hybrid stuff, particularly the Prius, but this can apply to other Toyota hybrid stuff, you may have run into a situation like this, and you may be familiar with some of the things that I'll explain in this episode. But if you don't regularly service these vehicles, or you haven't been down this road with the Toyota hybrid stuff or the Prius stuff, it can be a bit tricky jumping into it for the first time. And I can say I know a lot of people haven't, because even though these cars have been out there for a long time and a lot of shops are very proficient at diagnosing them and repairing them, there are still a ton of technicians and shops that we deal with on a regular basis that don't understand some of the differences that come into play when we have a hybrid vehicle, specifically of this brand, versus just our traditional ICE, internal combustion engine, with no high voltage battery, no electric motors involved with generating torque to move the vehicle or charge the battery. And it creates some things that are a little bit different that we need to understand. And particularly in a no-start situation. Obviously, it goes well beyond that as well. And we've talked a little bit about like isolation faults and things like that on the show. But when it comes to a no-start of the ICE, and you'll hear the internal combustion engine referred to as the ICE quite often when we are talking about hybrid vehicles, and it's just the easy acronym to refer to the gasoline portion of the powertrain versus the motor generators that are involved with supplying, torque to move the vehicle. But anyways, we still need the gasoline engine to start and run. Obviously, we're going to use that for power some of the time, but we're also going to use it to charge up the battery depending on the needs of the vehicle and the needs of the battery. Okay, so again, it's a hybrid. You got electric and gas. It's pretty obvious that you need the gas to run some of the time. So when you have a no start on one of these vehicles, there are some things that you want to consider. And number one, if you're not familiar with them, like I mentioned, or you're not familiar with the codes that are going to set, you may not even realize that it's a no start. And that might be the biggest piece that you take away from this episode if you don't work on these vehicles very often. But that's what we're going to talk about here. And then I'll get to the conclusion on this one, which was somewhat interesting to me anyways. But this is a 2015 Toyota Prius C, and it is a 1.5 liter engine connected to the electric powertrain. And the actual complaint from the customer is that this would run for 15-20 seconds and then shut off, and then it would not allow you to even attempt to start it again until you clear codes. All right. Now, this right there should be a big clue to you that there's something going on where the engine runs for 15-20 seconds. It sets a hybrid warning light on the dash, doesn't allow you to even attempt to crank it again or to run it again until you clear codes out with the scan tool. And the codes are going to be the big sign for you, the technician, so that you can identify what's going on here. So the two codes that you'll want to pay attention for, and there may be others, and there may be others to help you figure out why it's not starting. But in this case, these were the only codes that I had. But they're the important ones to say, oh, okay, this thing actually isn't starting. So there's a P3190 that sets in the engine control module, and that just says poor engine power. And then there is a P0A0F, which sets in the hybrid control unit that said engine failed to start. And there's your big one, right? Maybe I don't even need to be talking about this on a podcast to this audience, because it literally tells you in the code that will set every time that the engine failed to start. But that's the truth. The engine did not start. Now, here's where technicians get hung up, or they're not as clear on what's going on, is that when you listen to the engine, you look at the RPM of the engine, it appears to be running, and it appears to be running for that 15 to 20 seconds. However long it's actually cranking. Okay, so this is the actual electric motor spinning over the engine, and the engine is moving so quickly at a cranking speed that you would think that it's running. It sounds like it's running, but you get these codes after a period of time because the computer has realized, oh, this thing is not actually running. And if you look at the 3190, which is a poor engine performance code, and that actually there is a 3191, which means that the engine does not start. I don't know why that didn't set here, but it didn't. But the poor engine power code is that the actual engine torque is less than 20% of the requested engine torque for 6 seconds or 100 crankshaft turns, whichever happens first. What it's saying is, hey, I want torque out of the ice, but I am not getting it after a period of time. And when it decides that's the case, it will stop attempting to crank the engine. So it's not actually that the engine stalled, it's just that it gave up attempting to start it. But if you're just looking at this at face value on one of these hybrid vehicles, one of these Priuses, and it's attempting to start the engine, you would think that it's actually running. And I've made that mistake myself. The first time I ran into one of these on a Prius, it was a fuel pump. The fuel pump was out, there was zero fuel pressure, and it wasn't starting because there was no fuel pressure. I thought it was running. And so fuel pressure was not the first thing I went after because it sounds like it's actually running. And again, that might be the biggest thing you take away from this episode if you don't work on these cars, because you'll waste a lot of time. And here is the other thing, and this is the big warning about not only identifying that, hey, this engine isn't started, but what can happen if you attempt to start the engine over and over again. And actually, maybe before I get to that, let me just give you a couple quick ways that you can identify this situation beyond the codes, right? Maybe you just don't believe the codes. Okay, I want to actually verify that this engine is not running because it sure seems like it is. You can look at the data PIDs for the actual versus requested torque, and you can see that the engine is not going to be putting out anything, or maybe very little, but most likely it's not going to be putting out any torque, even though some is being requested. And it says in the code criteria for 3190 to look at these data PIDs, and you can assess it from there. The other thing that you can do, very simple, be careful, but I think most people have a good understanding of being under the hood of a gasoline engine, is you can check the temperature of the exhaust manifold. And in the case where an engine is not starting, your exhaust manifold is going to be cold. You would be able to touch it. Now, don't touch it if it's actually running because it's going to be very hot. But again, there's temp guns and there's ways that you can determine, is the manifold actually hot or not? And again, surprising if you've never run into this because you're like, oh, it's running. Clearly it's running. It's almost 1,000 RPM. That's the cranking speed of these Toyotas. So Again, if you haven't run into that, that's new. Now, if you continue to attempt to start it, and you have to clear codes every time, at least on this one, you did, and you may do this to try to determine what's wrong with it. Maybe you've already identified that, okay, this isn't actually starting, it's just cranking at a high speed, and it gives up after about 15 seconds or so of doing that. Now I have to determine why. The thing you want to be careful of here is that every time that you attempt to start this and it spins the engine for a period of time, you are draining the high voltage battery. And that's another piece that you could look at to infer that it's just spinning the engine and not starting it, is your high voltage battery voltage will drop every single attempt. And it is going to drop every single attempt because the engine doesn't start, so it can't actually charge the battery back up. You are just draining that battery. And the problem with that is if you continue to do that, you will eventually deplete the high voltage battery, which, yeah, it's not the end of the world. There's ways you can either take this apart, put a new battery in there, charge it back up, right? If any of the cells are bad, all that stuff, but that's a lot of work, right? You got to pull the battery pack out in order to do that. And if you're just trying to figure out why this thing doesn't start and the high voltage battery was not the problem in the first place, but now it is, well, you've got to fix that before you go into the actual no start. And unfortunately, that is something that happened on this one because so many attempts had been made. This episode is brought to you by L1 Automotive Training and Keith Perkins. If you're looking for education on module programming, J2534, EEPROM work, key and immobilizer, electrical diagnostics, or drivability diagnostics, Keith has a website, l1training.com, that's got over 60 hours of training videos on all those subjects and more. When I first started out doing mobile, I utilized Keith's videos on module programming in J2534 in order to get my head wrapped around what I would need for the tooling, the computers, the software setups, what kind of obstacles I would be up against when I'm out there programming modules on cars. And it was a huge benefit to me. And I continue to use the training videos that he has on his website. So I strongly recommend checking out l1training.com. The link is in the show notes. In order to try and start this thing, that there wasn't much left to go, and then eventually got to the point where clearing codes weren't even going to do. It would give like a small attempt to crank, and then it would just say there was a different code that said the high voltage battery pack is depleted. So then you got to either replace it or rebuild it or whatever you do to get that high voltage battery pack back up, just so you can then attempt to figure out what's going on. So another piece of advice on any hybrid no start, and I've talked a little bit about this before too, is you want to try and set up as many tests as you can and get them in one shot, right? So if you've got a 4-channel scope, use all 4 of those channels for whatever pieces of information that you feel you need to get, right? Are we getting injector pulse? Are we getting spark? Looking at the maybe WPS in one of the cylinders, obviously looking at fuel pressure, all of the stuff that could prevent an engine from starting or at least give us info into why it's not starting. And of course, there's a ton of different reasons why an engine might not start. It's just like any other internal combustion engine. And if you're familiar with the Prius, that are just like any other engine. But again, you only have so many shots. And depending on the health of that battery pack going into the diagnostic, you might be limited. And you can look at the voltage and kind of decide where you're at there. But gathering as much data in one shot is important on these, more so compared to just a 12-volt system where, hey, the battery dies, I'll throw a jump pack on it and continue cranking. You can't exactly do that here. So something to consider. Now, back to the car that I'm actually working on here, the no start on this thing. And we did have problems with the high voltage battery, and they had to correct that for us before that we could actually get to a solution. We had just about everything that we needed in order to start this, as far as spark, good spark out of the coil, injector pulse, WPS looked really good, like not a plugged cat or anything like that, and great compression. The waveform looked good there. We had fuel pressure, had just about everything that we thought we would need in order for this thing to start. And I should note, when you go to hit the key and you attempt to start this thing, you could hear some rattling at first. And I'm actually kind of wondering if this is where the 3190 poor engine performance came from versus the 3191 engine failed to start. Anyways, you could hear some rattling and then it would stop, and then it sounded like it was just running. Okay. And I wasn't exactly sure what that meant, but I know on some of these Priuses, because of the dampening device between the engine and the transmission, if you have a misfire, these things will make a horrible noise that makes you think that the engine's going to fall apart, but it's normal when there's a misfire on one of these. And I kind of heard that a little bit. I'm like, well, maybe it's popping off a little bit, but it's very hard to tell compared to a 12-volt battery cranking over an engine compared to this high-voltage Prius cranking over an engine. It doesn't sound the same as far as what I'm used to. So we went back and forth on this one, and eventually what I ended up doing, because this is part of my process for a no start, is I'll get a fuel sample. And I'll almost always do this when I hook up a gauge in order to check the pressure. Is, hey, I'm right there. I've already got connected to the fuel system if I'm tying in a gauge. Now, of course, there are situations where you're looking at a sensor on a scan tool. That's not going to apply. You're going to have to do an extra step to get a fuel sample. But especially if I'm hooked up to the actual line, like I was in this one, to check pressure, I want to check the actual sample of fuel to see what it looks like. And many times contaminated fuel has been the cause. I'll also check another thing when it comes to that is I will look at the gauge. Now, of course, look at the gauge, make sure it's not empty. You probably want to have fuel pressure in that case. I did have pressure, but the tank is completely full, like it's plumb full. And if you see a situation in a no-start vehicle, and it's just one of the things that I try to observe is, hey, okay, is the fuel completely full, right? And this isn't a 100% thing, but let's say somebody put in fuel that was a problem, they're usually going to fill up the tank. And so a full tank might indicate that, hey, there was a change as to what was in the tank just recently. Of course, you can question the customer. It's a little bit more of a process for us to do that because we're going through our customer, which is the shop, to then their customer. Not to say that it can't be done, but there's an extra step to it. Anyways, I take a look at that and I'm like, okay, I definitely want to check the fuel sample on this one because it is completely full. And here's the other thing, it's a delivery vehicle. There was stickers on the side that this Prius is actually, being used as a delivery vehicle. And not that means anything really, but what are the odds that somebody doesn't actually, own this vehicle? Maybe they put in the wrong fuel. And maybe they didn't do anything wrong. It is possible just to get bad fuel depending on where you fill up. That's the other possibility. So anyways, I want a fuel sample from this thing. And I pull the fuel sample and immediately I look at it. I'm like, oh, this is not gasoline. And I can only say that from many times doing a fuel sample, getting regular pump gasoline with it's about 10% ethanol here for the 87 octane here in Minnesota. And it has the regular gas, has kind of a light yellowish tint, and it's fairly clear, meaning you could see through it. I put it into a glass graduated cylinder so that I can do like an E85 test. It's really easy to do there. But I'm looking at it. I'm looking for sediment. I'm looking for something that doesn't look like gas. And this does not look like gas. It's almost like a bright yellow, which is not the way that gasoline looks. And if you're not following me on audio too much, you can Google this and you'll see the difference. But this to me looked like diesel fuel. Okay. Now, I'm not 100% sure. And the smell, it kind of smells a little bit like gas. But my guess is that there probably is a little bit of gas in here. It probably wasn't completely empty. But what is in there mixed with it is definitely not gasoline. It's a very different color, and it's almost a different consistency too. And again, that's hard to transfer over audio on a podcast, but if you've seen enough gasoline, you can pick out what's not gasoline. Now, if you're not sure, you could do the next thing I did, which was kind of to prove it to the shop that this was not gasoline, is find a safe place, pour a little bit of it out, and try to actually light it on fire. Okay, so we went out back of the shop. We just found a spot on the ground, poured a little bit of it out, took a lighter up to it, and as I'm sure all of you know, if it's actual gasoline, it's going to go and it's going to burn very quickly and very hot. If it is diesel fuel, it is not going to do that. Yes, it will burn, but it's going to burn very slowly. It will be like the same amount of flames as you lit like a piece of paper on fire. It's very slowly, and it will just sit there with little flames and burn. And that's what it did here. So it's a very different burn because diesel is meant to be ignited under super high compression, not in a gasoline engine with a spark. Very different things, right? Still trying to get energy out of the fuel through combustion, but a different way of doing it. And diesel fuel is not going to burn the gasoline engine. And so we proved there that this is diesel fuel that's in this tank, and it's, completely full. So you guys need to drain the tank and fill it with gasoline and clean everything else out. And we recommended, checking the spark plugs and the cylinders, dry all that stuff out best you can. So they did that, and they said, yeah, the tank was full. I don't know how they filled it with diesel, because obviously the diesel nozzles are wider than the gasoline nozzles. But when there's a will, there's a way. I don't know exactly how it happened, but I know that's what was in there. So anyways, they clear it out. They get it all back together. They say, hey, this thing still is doing the same thing, where it'll crank for a while, seem like it's running, and then it'll shut off. And we tried a couple times, but we don't want to drain the battery. Will you come back out and check it out? So I come back out and I check it out. And I'm still pretty confident about what I found, but I'm going back over to my steps to make sure I didn't miss anything. One thing I had kind of skipped over was like an EGR being unplugged, or I'm sorry, an EGR being plugged open could cause something like this. Looking at my sensor values, and everything looks like it's there. And now I actually have, quality gas running up to this thing with good fuel pressure. But the one thing that they didn't do was actually change the spark plugs. They took them out and they dried them off, but what ends up happening there when those things get soaked with diesel fuel is they're not going to work there. If they're fouled out, and is it impossible to get them working again? Probably not, but just put a new set of spark plugs in there. So they did that, and then it fired right up immediately after that. And again, I took the spark plug and I held it up and I put the lighter across it, and you can see it's wet and it's not burning. Like it's like you dipped it in water, and I was like, get some new spark plugs for it. So I know those are maybe low tech tests to run. I think you can do a specific gravity test if you really want to figure out if it's diesel or gas or whatever mixture. But I mean, those tests work, and they prove it, and they can prove it to the person standing there of like, oh yeah, this is not gasoline. So diesel changed out with gasoline and a new set of spark plugs, got this one to start. But I thought what was more important on this to get out on the podcast was the couple notes about the no starts in hybrid vehicles like this, where you may think it's running, but it's not. Pay attention to the codes, pay attention to the data pads, look at the exhaust temperature. And also with that, be aware of how you're draining down the high voltage battery as you're attempting to start it. Get as much info as you can from each attempt. That's what's really important on this one. So that's where I'm going to wrap this one up. And thank you everybody for listening. I really appreciate it. But with that all out of the way, let's get out there, start fixing the world one car at a time.